The Cannon Cart is a card that was a little bit weak when it was first released, and then it received a buff, and another buff, and another buff, and all of a sudden it was really strong for a little while, so they decided it was worthy of a nerf or two. And then in the most recent set of balance changes, after another recent buff, they buffed it again, so now it's actually in a really strong spot, pretty much where it was at before in its former glory. So tonight we're going to be taking a look at this really powerful and interesting Cannon Cart Splashyard style deck. So let's start the video off here going up against the Royal Giant deck. Now this Cannon Cart Splashyard deck, it's really popular right now. As you guys know, I find a lot of my decks, for my videos on Royale API. I used to use like Stats Royale and Deck Shop, but I don't use them so much anymore. I mostly use this site instead. And just because, you know, it's easy to navigate and it shows you the decks, you know, that people have used to complete grand challenges, you know, up to the last few minutes even. You can also search classic challenges, of course, if you prefer, or top ladder, so on and so forth. And then you can also search, you know, decks that are particularly popular by usage rate or win percent over the past day or 3 days or the past week, however you want to filter it. So I generally use that website and go for decks that are either really popular or that a pro has used to get a grand challenge win with, because then I know that it's a fun, interesting deck and it's also very viable and it can have the potential to do really well. So this one, it's definitely a very popular deck. It's kind of the current top meta graveyard deck, if I'm not mistaken. I know there's always going to be other variations, but this one's definitely really powerful right now. It has a lot of different synergy that works out really well, mostly the splash damage and the tornado, and that's just kind of, you know, pretty straightforward, honestly, but I'll talk about it a little bit more in depth as we go along here. So the Cannon Cart, as I mentioned, they reverted the buff, or rather the nerf, with a buff. And basically, they returned it to where it was. It now has the same stats as where it was at when it was really powerful and when it was really prevalent and used, you know, all over the place in a lot of different decks. So it surprised me at first that it wasn't like super popular and thrown all over the place like it was, you know, back in the day when it was really strong the first time. And I think that's just because, you know, that's just where we're at in the current meta. Every meta is a little bit different. And sometimes cards are really strong just based on, you know, other cards that are weak at that kind of time or in that particular meta. You know, so maybe it's even things like, oh, this pro won a tournament with this deck, so everybody's going to be playing this deck, right? And that happens. You know, you'll see like the people win the global tournaments, you know, with 150 wins with the Expo deck, and all of a sudden everybody will be playing Expo, so usage rates go up but win rates go down. So it depends on the current meta, and I just feel like the Cannon Cart isn't super prevalent in this meta like it was before, but it's still a really strong card, and it still fits really well and very naturally into these graveyard decks, particularly this kind of Splashyard style deck. So let's go ahead and talk about that strong element of Splash next. And this particular match is probably going to be wrapped up here pretty soon. We'll see how it goes. We'll jump on into another one. But anyway, let's get started with that. So there's a lot of cards in this deck that have splash synergy. Mainly, of course, the tornado. Everything mostly focuses around sucking it into the center of the tornado and then splashing it with a bunch of different units. So you got the Baby Dragon, you got the Ice Wizard, you've got the Barbarian Barrel, you got the Poison. All these things synergize really well when your opponents are pulled into the center, when all their units are pulled into the center of the tornado, or whenever they're just naturally like clumped up at the bridge or defending on the tower or something like that as well. Now this particular match is up against a mortar deck. Looks like it's the hog mortar bait kind of deck, or at least a variation of it. And I'm going backwards here. I used my 9th win, I think it was, first, you know, and I got like about 9 wins with this deck. Pretty good for me in a classic challenge personally. You know, I'm not that great of a player, so, you know, 9 wins is actually pretty decent. So anyway, this one is against, looks like, yeah, it's that hog mortar bait deck, but it looks like he's doing Dark Goblin. I don't know if that's traditionally in there, but anyway, we're going backwards here. So this one is probably going to be my 8th win here. So let's talk about that splash synergy. So, you know, the most straightforward thing is going to be pulling everything into one area with your tornado and splashing it down with like your baby dragon or your ice wizard. But that, you know, ice wizard tornado combo works really well on defense. And then you've also got the what is it, the Tombstone in there. Oh man, that's just the trifecta on defense right there. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail as we go along here. But as far as, you know, the overall splash damage goes, you can just really use that on together on defense for, you know, just a ton of synergy and a ton of positive elixir trades. And that's really at the heart of this deck, is playing defense, getting those positive elixir trades, going in for a powerful counter push, using that graveyard on offense, and just, you know, wrecking them, you know, catching them off guard and destroying their tower. So, you know, you can just use like any of the spells or the baby dragon or the, what is it, the ice wizard on defense combined with the tornado and shut down almost any push that they have. Of course, if they've got like a big P.E.K.K.A. or golem or something coming down the lane, it's not going to shut it down quite as well, but it will do like great work against their support units, like, you know, the Night Witch, for example, or the Lumberjack or something that might be behind their golem. So if you can't suck it all into the center with the tornado, then you might be able to, you know, get them clumped up, as I mentioned, at the bridge. And, you know, let's say that like you've used your hog, or they've used their hog and you've used their tornado on the hog, you know, to pull it away from getting into your tower, and then you don't have the tornado in cycle, or whatever reason, for whatever reason you don't have it in cycle. Their units are naturally going to be clumped together as they cross the bridge. If they're, you know, all melee units, or all the ranged units will clump together, and you can take advantage of that splash damage, you know, with the ice wizard, with the baby dragon, with your spells, even without the tornado. And on top of all of this, you can really use it on offense as well. If you're going in for a big offensive push, you can pull everything into their princess tower, your opponent's tower, and allow your baby dragon and your ice wizard to just do absolute, you know, devastation to your opponent's units. And ideally, in that scenario, they'll also be able to be chipping away at the tower as well. Now let's talk a little bit about the graveyard itself and when to send it in, because this is your major win condition, if not your only real win condition. And you don't want to just be using it by itself, or any time that you get an opportunity, you're like, oh, I have a surviving unit, let me just, you know, send it in, send the graveyard in. Like, in theory, yeah, that's good, that's what you want to be doing, but you want to time it properly and possibly, you know, catch them off guard and surprise them with the graveyard. So generally, you have your cannon cart and you've got your baby dragon as your relatively tanky units. And these are the things they can be taking for your graveyard. Because as I mentioned, ooh, look at that fun new emote, I love that one. You don't want to be sending in the graveyard on its own, even with just the poison, because then they'll be able to counter it really well, and you've just spent 9 elixir on your graveyard and poison. And so what I'm saying here is you want to be sending it in with some sort of support, some sort of thing that has played the defensive role and then is going on to offense, like the cannon cart, like the baby dragon, something that's a little bit tanky, so that once the princess tower has locked onto that cannon cart or that baby dragon, you know, your graveyard will spawn all those skeletons, and they won't be just constantly plowed down by that princess tower, one after the other, because the princess tower will be, you know, distracted by your, in this case, it's going to be generally your baby dragon or your cannon cart. You could potentially use the ice wizard as well. He's not as tanky as he once was. I really miss the old ice wizard when he was more tanky and didn't do as much damage, but that's, you know, a story for another video. I don't want to get too much into that right now. But what I do want to mention is, if you don't have the opportunity to use your baby dragon or your cannon cart on offense, or, you know, have them on defense and then go in for the offensive push to be the tank, you can always use the Barbarian Barrel in a pinch if you absolutely must. If you want to just have a little bit of a mini tank to get a little bit of damage off onto the tower with your graveyard, the Barbarian Barrel does spawn that single Barbarian, and he can survive for a few seconds from the Princess Tower if nothing else is damaging him. So if you absolutely must, it's definitely an option. Now, I talked about this ultimate defensive combo, the trifecta on defense, and if you watch CWA or Clash with Ash, you'll hear him talk about this a lot. And it's interesting because Tombstone was nerfed, and I felt like, okay, maybe it's gonna be, it's not gonna be super strong anymore. It's you know, completely fallen off the map. But honestly, it plays a pretty much similar, if not the exact same role. You know, it's just a little bit weaker. It doesn't spawn as many skeletons and doesn't spawn them as quickly. And I think it got an HP nerf too or something like that. But it's not that big of a deal. Like, it still works out really great. And having the Ice Wizard and the Tornado and the Tombstone all on defense, I mean, you can just constantly be shutting down their, you know, their P.E.K.K.A. See, the P.E.K.K.A.'s always going to be distracted in this case by all those little skeletons. And then in this case, again with the Hog Rider, you've got the Hog, and it didn't get distracted by the Tombstone. But then I've just got the Tornado to pull in the Hog. So I've got so much on defense, and on top of all of that, you've got the Ice Wizard, which has that consistent slow effect. And if you guys remember, you know, people were raging because when they put out a Twitter poll for like what are we going to buff next, instead of, you know, doing like the Bomber or something, they did the Ice Wizard and they increased its slow duration, so it's like 2.5 seconds or something like that now. So, you know, you're constantly pulling everything in with the Tornado and it's getting slowed by the Ice Wizard, and then it gets distracted by the Tombstone, and it just never has a chance to connect to your tower. Unless you mess up like I did just there. But even then, see, I didn't get it onto the Tombstone in time, so I just pulled it all away with the Tornado, and that with the Cannon Cart and the Tombstone, the Tornado, that was enough to completely take out that P.E.K.K.A. and that Hog Rider. So it worked out really great. That defensive combo there is just insane, and I used the Graveyard there at the end just to kind of finish him off, you know, get a little bit of gyp damage. That's all that I needed there to finish that match. Now apparently my opponent here didn't get the memo because he is running Freeze in this deck, and Freeze got a noticeable nerf in the last patch. I feel again like it's not that big of a deal, but apparently that 5-second down to 4-second duration is a big deal. And a lot of decks, if not all decks that were running Graveyard, you know, in the meta, were running Freeze for a while in the place of Poison. But now we're running the classic Poison Graveyard combination, and it works out really great again. You know, it's just really strong in the current meta, and you're generally going to be using the Poison on top of your Graveyard, depending on the matchup, of course. You're going to be switching it up. But the Poison has taken the place of that Freeze. As I mentioned, Freeze just isn't as strong after the nerf. It got a duration reduction and also got a reduction in the amount of damage that it deals. So, I don't know. I feel like if you want to run it, it's still viable, but Poison is just a better option at this point. And you can see my opponent here doesn't do the best job of placing his Graveyard, but he does Freeze there. But I'm able to put down the Poison and just completely take out all his skeletons, no worries. I put down the Ice Wizard unnecessarily at the end there, probably just reacted or something. Anyway guys, let's go ahead and keep talking about what I wanted to do here. And the next thing that I wanted to mention was, you know, if you're looking for something to cycle, because this does run a lot of spells, you got Tornado, you've got Barbarian Barrel, and you've got the Poison. You know, you can always just Barbarian Barrel on your own, even as like an opener, or to cycle when you're at max elixir. Because if you use it at the bridge and your opponent doesn't respond to it at all, then the Barbarian gets like 1 or 2 swings off onto the tower, which is a little bit of chip damage for only 2 elixirs. So it is an option at any time, not only to tank for your Graveyard. You don't have to Graveyard every time that you send in the Barbarian Barrel, but, you know, again, that's kind of like a makeshift tank or a potential cycle card if you're looking to get something out of your hand. Because, you know, these 3 spell decks, you do often end up with these awkward hands where you don't really have a good unit to play, so you may have to just end up cycling one of your spells. This one not so much, but in some decks you can actually do things like use your log or your zap on your opponent's tower just to cycle it out. So general rule for this deck is, as I mentioned a while ago, is to be playing defense and then going in for a deadly counter push. So you generally will not send in your Graveyard by itself. You're going to be playing defense with a Cannon Cart or with that, you know, super trifecta defensive combination with the Ice Wizard and the Tornado and the Tombstone, and then, you know, you got your Baby Dragon or your Ice Wizard still alive with all that splash synergy and get those positive elixir trades. And then that's when you go in for the counter push and use the Graveyard and just decimate your opponent's tower. Now, using that Graveyard, one thing that you may want to consider and keep in mind is to just completely catch them off guard with it. You know, your opponent will probably at this point recognize your deck if they know what they're doing, unless you're just running it on ladder, you know, at a random trophy range, or if you're running it maybe in classic challenges and you don't necessarily see all the same meta decks all the time. But anyway, if you're going up against a Grand Challenge opponent or a higher match up against somebody in a classic challenge, then they'll probably recognize your deck. But if they don't, you can save your graveyard and try to catch them off guard, and save it maybe into double elixir time. Sometimes just save it until a little bit later once you've got that really powerful counter push going. I often catch myself with this deck and decks like this, graveyard decks in general, at a huge deficit, and I'll be like, okay, my tower only has 500 health and their tower is at full or near full, and the match is almost over and there's no way I'm going to come back now, and then I just play a good defense and go in for that massive counter push and use the graveyard, and it just decimates their tower. It's really impressive how much damage that graveyard can do. And the skeletons, when they spawn, they can be doing things like, in this case, they see they're chipping away at that wizard, and that brings it low enough for me to be able to poison it. I don't do it in that particular scenario, but it is an option. So they can chip away at whatever your opponent has to put down. And of course, you're almost always going to be putting the graveyard on top of your poison, or rather the poison on top of your graveyard, preemptively, because that they're going to put like their bats or their goblin gang or their skeleton armor or something to counter your graveyard. But once you've done this once or twice, they're probably going to catch on. So consider hanging on to your elixir and not using your poison unless you know that they're probably going to use something to defend against your graveyard and where they're going to use it. Or maybe wait until they put it down. If it's something like a musketeer or a wizard, as soon as they put it down, you can put your poison down, so you make sure that you clip that thing as well. So as I mentioned, guys, one massive push with this graveyard, it can just destroy their tower. It can look like things are really bad and you're losing, and then you could just go in for a counter push and just wreck them. So don't be super aggressive with it. Don't be too cocky or greedy or anything like that. Hang tight. When the time is right, go in for that counter push and destroy their tower. Alright, let's do opening moves and card replacements really quick. So for opening moves for this deck, generally you're just going to be playing defense. As I mentioned, you may get into that awkward hand situation where you've got a bunch of spells and, maybe a Tombstone. Well, that's not great, because Tombstone actually is a pretty solid opener. You can open with Tombstone. You can cycle Ice Wizard or Baby Dragon in the back. Cannon Cart's a little bit more risky. You don't generally cycle it in the back. It's more of an aggressive card to use at the bridge, or something that you use on defense for high DPS, and then to distract your opponent's giant or hog or something like that once it pops into the cannon form. And obviously you're not going to be opening with the graveyard, but you could cycle one of your cheaper cards. You could always use the Barbarian Barrel at the bridge, try to get a little bit of chip damage off onto their tower, or of course you could wait for your opponent to make the first move, and then you can counter accordingly. And as you guys know, I'm not the kind of person that likes to do that, but if that's how you prefer to do it, then of course this is definitely a great deck to do that with. Now what about card replacements? Well, let's go through the card list really quickly. If we're looking at the top left of the screen here, we can see all the cards, and you can see there's the Tombstone. Well, I really like the Ice Wizard Tornado Tombstone combo. I would not take the Tombstone out if you could, but if you have to, maybe replace it with like a defensive structure, or even like a Furnace would be great. Now that I'm looking at it, a relatively similar role, and just similar elixir cost. Let's do the spells all at the end here. So let's do the Baby Dragon next. For the Baby Dragon and even the Ice Wizard, honestly, you could go for like Executioner. That would be a great replacement. For the Baby Dragon, maybe even a regular wizard. I wouldn't recommend running Ice Wizard and a regular wizard in the same deck though, because then they can get Fireball or Lightning together, and it's just generally going to be a negative elixir trade for you, because they'll often clump up at the bridge given that they have similar move speed and similar range. But the Baby Dragon and the Executioner and the Boulder are all relatively tanky, so those are definitely viable options for those two for replacements. If you don't have anything else, you can always just do like a Musketeer, an E-Wiz, some sort of range support card, especially for that Ice Wizard there. But I recommend some sort of a splash damage card. That would be really good. For the cannon card, again, just some sort of a range support card. Musketeer would be an okay replacement. Something that is a little bit tanky would be good. Maybe you could even go for a mini tank, like, an Ice Golem or something like that. But the cannon card is really strong right now, and that's kind of core in this deck. And I would definitely recommend running it if you do have it. For the graveyard, if you switch out the graveyard, obviously you're going to have a completely different deck. It's not going to be a Splashyard deck. But, you know, there used to be like a Splashyard deck, and then you would just switch out the graveyard for an X-Bow, and it became the Splash Bow deck. So you could try that out if you like it, or just put another win condition in there, you know, like a Hog Rider or a Giant. And honestly, it would probably work out pretty well. You've got a lot of cards that just have synergy on their own with whatever win condition. The graveyard just works out really well, but you know, another win condition would probably work out as well. So anyway, what about the spells? Spells are really easy to replace. With the Barbarian Barrel, you can always just switch it out for another cheap spell, like the Log would be a go-to replacement for Barbarrel. If you want to just do Zap, I like Zap a lot, and that's great too. You can always switch it up and have some fun and do a Snowball. For the Poison, well, Poison works really well in these graveyard decks. You could do a Freeze. As I mentioned earlier, Freeze is still decent, but Poison is kind of the go-to preferred version in the current meta. You could always do a Fireball, but that doesn't work out quite as well because it doesn't give you that consistent damage over time to clear out the path for your graveyard. Whereas the Freeze, you know, freezes everything and clears everything out in an area almost instantly, and then the Poison, you know, gives you damage over time. Let's see, what else do we have there? For the Tornado, I mean, there isn't really a replacement for the Tornado, honestly, unfortunately, because it's just so unique. But you could always just go for maybe like another defensive structure to double up with that Tombstone. I don't know, maybe another spawner, honestly, make it a little bit spawntastic, but you could not really replace that Tornado for much because it's so unique and it's just very important and very vital in this kind of splash themed deck. That's it for tonight, guys. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the very end here. I really appreciate it. Make sure to leave the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and you know, leave a comment in the comment section below if you have any questions or just want to say, hey, what's cracking. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and have a good night.